Before that, I want to do an anthropological search. Raise your hand if you have a Weibo account. Or had. It could be in the past. Okay, raise your hand if you have WeChat account. Nice. Raise your hand if you have a Twitter account or now X. Raise your hand if you have, what is the one, like Blue Sky? Yeah, who know Blue Sky? Anyone knows Blue Sky? Okay, not Blue. Raise your hand if you have Instagram. Okay. Raise your hand if you think you're a wall dancer. A wall dancer. Okay. Now we're getting into the explanation of wall dancer. For the past 30 years, the internet users in China, they have no choice but dance in the shackles against the Great Firewall. This means they need to evade censors, build solidarity through coded languages, carve out dignity in the surveilled internet. So we are familiar with Me Too movement, which is also Rice Bunny Me Too movement. We also know the white paper protest is a way of dodging censorship, because how can you censor something that's not even written on the paper? This particular movement is actually a reactional way of people pushing against the censors. But watching America today in 2026, 2025, when you know the TikTok transferred ownership, people all of a sudden couldn't search certain keywords, and if they search certain keywords such as Epstein, they find empty feed, which is the day-to-day experience of a Chinese internet user. Yi-Ling and I had a conversation before this talk, and where a line strikes me the most is Americans are going to have to learn how to be wall dancers too. We're talking about wall dancer as this artful, mindful, almost sometimes like even joyful act between you, an internet user, and the censorship itself. And sometimes when you're dancing against a wall and dancing in the shackles, there's a certain joy, like when you recognize the other one is dancing as well, because this memes you could recognize, there's like certain messages the censors don't know, the algorithm doesn't know, but like you kind of get it because they're basically speaking certain truth and you can get it. So I think let's start with this metaphor with the book title, The Wall Dancers. Like, why do you choose the word dance instead of in other sense, fighters or dissidents? Like, why dance?
Yeah, so first, thanks so much for your question, and thanks so much for coming out here on this very cold Thursday. I want to explain the title, The Wall Dancers, to all of the confused faces who looked back at us when Afra said, "Are you a wall dancer?" It comes from this Chinese phrase, dancing in shackles, or 带着铁链跳舞. And it was first used by journalists in the early 2000s to describe the experience of writing and reporting under state constraints. So after that, it quickly became viral. It wasn't just journalists who were using it. There were science fiction writers who were using it, musicians, software engineers. And this metaphor resonated with me in particular because it captured this experience of living in China and navigating Chinese society as a kind of dance, a dynamic push and pull between state and society. Right here was a place where things were rich with innovation and yet rigidly constrained. Here was a society where a gay dating app could go public on the New York Stock Exchange one year and another one could get shut down the next year. Here was a society where hip hop could go viral, mainstream one month and then get banned off television another month. And I found that the dynamic of this dance was most vibrant on the Chinese internet, behind what we all know as the Great Firewall. So I use this term dance instead of, fighter, dissident, because I think those words don't accurately describe that experience to begin with. And secondly, it's creative, it's artful, as you say, it's dynamic. And I came to know the individuals who were particularly good at navigating this constantly shifting terrain. I came to know them as dancers or wall dancers.
Yeah, Chinese internet is almost a little bit cursed because even you're someone like Hu Xijin, this notoriously famous big mouth, constantly say something that's pro-state, you still get canceled as well. Hu Xijin, his account was suspended in 2024 for saying something, wrong, judged by the wall that's moving, that's constantly looking for things to attack. So like everyone need to be a dancer if you want to just exist on the Chinese internet. Now we can talk about the dancers. So there are actually 5 main protagonists, like 5 main dancers in Yi-Ling's book. The first one is Ma Baoli, who went from being a police officer in Qinhuangdao running, and then like later he founded Blood, which is China's largest gay dating app, and eventually he shook hands with Premier Li Keqiang back then as this like recognized entrepreneurial dream that's been realized by a gay founder. And there's another dancer, her name is Lu Ping, it's also a feminist activist we all know, who was a state journalist and quit her job. When she quit her job, she's saying, I'm the generation of 1989. And later she started to build the like native feminist movement in China. And later in 2016, I think she moved to the US, in a sense, became a political exile. The third dancer is Cafe Hu, who is an underground rapper from Sichuan, learning to toe the line between being a rapper, being provocative, to being permissible, to being like, in a sense, getting recognition from the mainstream. And then there's Chen Qiufan, a former Google tech worker, later turned into a science fiction writer. And the last one is, I think is the most interesting one, is Eric Liu. He is a Weibo censor himself, in a sense, like representing the wall. So there are 5 very captivating characters. But why them? Like during your journalistic journey, you definitely met and talked to many wall dancers, but why these 5 dancers in particular?
Yeah, I met a lot of wall dancers, but I definitely had a certain way of narrowing my frame and narrowing my reporting gaze. And I would say I was particularly drawn to the margins. So the underground, the subaltern, away from the mainstream and the center. And I think the key reason behind that is because I believed this is where the most creative and imaginative dances bloomed. So as Afra mentioned, the queer communities, feminist activists, the hip hop underground, science fiction writers. I will say though, even though these subjects were very much on the edges of society in some ways, they were also part of the mainstream. So a lot of them had one foot on the edges of society and one foot in the mainstream. A good example is Ma Baoli. As you mentioned, he was a leader of the queer community and ran this underground gay website for many years, but he was also a policeman. He was a cop. So he really knew how to speak the language of authority. He could, like a lot of them, speak in tongues, code switch, wear many hats, and it allowed them to have this kind of creativity and adaptability and look for leverage points of change within the system. Lastly, I would say a big reason why I was drawn to this particular set of characters is because we shared a set of personal questions. Like I was thinking through a lot of the questions that they were thinking through. We shared a sense of personal stakes. So, I was reaching out to the hip hop artists as I was thinking about my own place as an artist within creative constraints in China. I reached out to the queer communities as I was thinking about my own place within it. I was, reaching out to the feminist activists as I was thinking through what it meant to build solidarity amidst pandemic isolation. I sought out the science fiction writers as we were thinking through what it meant to find spiritual meaning and purpose at a moment when technological upheaval was completely disorienting. So I think that was also another unifying characteristic of all of the people that I decided to speak with.
I think there's a particular sort of craft in this book that I really admire, because the freer, more chaotic, more permissible Chinese internet was part of my identity and is part of my formative memory. I still remember getting a lot of political awakening moments back then, because back then you can actually talk about China's political reform. You can talk about the air pollution issues. You can talk about, the peasant workers in the city couldn't get properly paid. You can talk about dislocation because of the Beijing Olympics, such and such. And this civic space is gone. But I think in your book, somehow you restored a lot of the moments, a lot of the atmosphere by giving a lot of details, as well as just basically, I almost feel like I was teleported to the past, and there are like certain moments I also cried because I genuinely felt connection with those characters in your book, such as Ma Baoli. First to learn about you can actually talk about being gay on the internet, and then he was free. After the night of reading Beijing Story. It's a famous online novel, which is quite like monumental to the Chinese LGBTQ community. So you did a lot of work in terms of crafting those scenes, like taking us back to the Chinese internet that no longer exists. Can you maybe talk about your crafting experiences? Like, what is your process of collecting the primary sources? What is the process of interviewing them, and then the writing itself?
First, Afra, I'll say you're my favorite reader. I'm glad that it moved you. I hope that someone else wins this role that Afra has right now, a favorite reader. My writing and reporting process, I will say that it was very, very long and involved. So, for example, let's take Ma Baoli. Like a lot of the other subjects that I profiled, I had spent maybe weeks, if not months, sometimes years, reporting and writing and researching about the things that they cared about, the communities that they were part of, before I even approached them. So, for example, Ma Baoli, he's the CEO of the gay dating app. Back in 2019, I was fascinated by Blued, this gay dating app, and I was fascinated by his story because, cop turns tech mogul is just a fascinating story. And I reached out to the Blued PR team and I said, hey, this is awesome. I would love to profile you for the New York Times Magazine. And we had a 3-week-long negotiation, at the end of which they said very kindly and gently, no, we would not like to participate in your interview. And I was disappointed, but I knew this story was too good to let go of. And so I ended up pursuing the story anyway. And I did what the journalist Gay Talese did, for those of you who are familiar with this nonfiction journalist, when he wrote a profile about Frank Sinatra, where Frank Sinatra wouldn't agree to be interviewed, but he ended up interviewing every single person who knew Frank Sinatra. So I did that with Ma Baoli. I interviewed Blued users, I interviewed Blued investors, I interviewed Blued ex-employees, I interviewed people who were participating in LGBT civil society in Beijing, who were, very much part of queer communities in Beijing. And I ended up having, I think, a much better story as a result. Like, it wasn't this straight business profile of a company, but this kind of portrait of an online queer ecosystem. And fast forward a year later, the story's published. I go back to Ma Baoli and I'm like, okay, I'm still here. Would you be willing to be profiled for my book? And he said yes, because he could see that I wasn't going to go away and that I really cared about the story. The other thing that I would say about my reporting process is that I never really saw myself as a kind of like investigative journalist digging for scoops and revealing information that had otherwise not been out in the world. A lot of the subjects that I interviewed were public figures, and they'd shared a lot of their story online and social media and Chinese media interviews. And I saw myself more as a kind of scavenger, like scooping all of these details together, weaving them into a coherent narrative, having them kind of fill in the blanks and bring color and life and humanity into their stories, such that, like with this scene that you mentioned, essentially Ma Baoli goes into an internet cafe. He reads the story, Beijing Story, for the first time by an anonymous writer, and he realizes that he's not alone. And he's talked about this moment many times on social media and in Chinese media, but I wanted to really bring it out in flesh and blood. So I sat him down and asked him many times, what did the internet cafe look like? Who was sitting next to you? What did the color of the sky look like? Were you crying? Because it was a hugely cathartic, revelatory moment, and I wanted to really capture that.
So a warning of that scene is because you are likely to cry, because Izzy and I, we both cried when we were reading that scene. And also some other portrayal of other protagonists and characters we know, or this, for example, Lu Ping. Lu Ping's this unyielding energy is exactly, if you know Lu Ping herself, this is exactly her energy. So in the Chinese policy as well as internet in general has this cyclical pattern called fang and shou, right? It's opening and tightening. And recently you wrote a Wired piece exploring this fascinating tension in China. Actually, in AI, is the State Council start to announce this new registry system to register all the AI services, from large language models to other stuff. And then this is clearly a show moment for the AI scene that's the state has been fang for quite a long time. So how do you explain this show and fang in this dynamic?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just step back a little and explain what exactly feng and shou is. But for most of modern Chinese history, society has moved in cycles of what some scholars have called feng and shou, or opening and tightening. And, this goes as early as the Cultural Revolution. So the repressive era of the Cultural Revolution was followed by this period of pragmatic loosening. The kind of freewheeling period of the late 1980s was followed by the Tiananmen crackdown. And the basic idea is when the system and society closes up and becomes too rigid, calls for reform emerge, and it provokes a loosening. And when the system tightens up and becomes, when the system opens up and becomes kind of too destabilizing, authorities will step in and assert control. And so we see this dynamic even today, as you mentioned, with AI, but with the state's relationship with its tech entrepreneurs. If we think back to the mid-2010s, it was this very freewheeling period for a lot of tech moguls, right? The state was actively encouraging people to seize opportunities for VC money to come in.
万众创业, everyone doing entrepreneurial stuff is,
Exactly. And for a lot of people, for entrepreneurs during that period, this was a period of feng. But that was quickly derailed during the big tech crackdowns in 2021, when this kind of dream of freewheeling entrepreneurship was pretty rapidly quashed.
It actually comes with the next question, which is the China tech's Chuhai scene. I think Chuhai is in a sense part of the result of China's tech crackdown, and also just you will see this newer consensus or newer collective consciousness that Chinese tech can and actually win the global audience and can actually win the global users and can actually, in a sense, beat Silicon Valley in certain dimensions. And this 出海 literally means going out to sea. When it's the most successful case, which would be TikTok. And of course, you also have Temu, you have Shein, you have 小红书, for example, last year all of a sudden welcomed a bunch of lost U.S. internet exiles. That's absolutely one of the most fascinating thing that I witnessed. I remember like spending days and nights like reading the interactions between the TikTok, the American Xiaohongshu users like interacting with Chinese Xiaohongshu users, like have some genuine exchanges. So you profile a lot of tech workers and entrepreneurs who would see Chuhai going overseas as a way to regain like one's agency, to make money, to fulfill their entrepreneurial dream, but also it is in a sense a pursuit of personal freedom. What do you think about the Chuhai moments? And I also want you to like sort of relate to the whole like entrepreneurial generation that Ma Baoli represents. What do you think of the whole Chuhai dynamic?
Yeah, so Chuhai, for context, is to go overseas. It's the idea that you can create this homegrown tech product back home in China and take that product globally and sell it out there, right? And anyone who has been a China tech reporter or has been watching China tech over the last 10 years knows that Chuhai is like a very important story to follow, because go back to 2014, the narrative back then with Chinese tech was China can't innovate. This idea that China is creating copycat apps, right? China is going to create Facebook, but on its own domestic turf. Weibo is China's Twitter. But very quickly, I think people realized that it was possible for innovation to take place on China's own home turf. The classic example, the kind of ultimate Chuhai story that we're all familiar with, is TikTok. So ByteDance created it on its own home turf, and now it's globally one of the most popular social media apps in the world. The same with a lot of the other examples that you mentioned, not as famous as TikTok, but Xiaohongshu, Red Note. Nobody knew what it was a couple of years ago, but now it's shaping culinary trends in Dusseldorf and tourism in Thailand. BYD, which is essentially a car plugged to the internet, is now making inroads in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And then you have even AI companies at this point, like Alibaba's Quen, right? I think at some point Airbnb's CEO said something like, I don't use ChatGPT. We don't use ChatGPT. We actually use Alibaba's Quen. So I think what's fascinating to me about this Chuhai story, this idea that Chinese tech companies are going abroad, is that on one hand, we see the Chinese internet is contracting, right? It's becoming more controlled. It's becoming more censored. It's becoming more constrained. But on the other hand, it's expanding. It's expanding way beyond its own borders, such that many more people, not just Chinese users, are going to have to learn how to use the Chinese internet too. Like, I have a friend in this room who's ordering candles off Temu. And, like Temu has a Super Bowl ad. So it's very much present in the Chinese public consciousness. I think, though, with TikTok, and what I find fascinating about this particular narrative is that it has tried to go global and has tried to establish, or ByteDance has tried to establish TikTok as a global company just at the moment that the internet is becoming more closed and siloed. So it's doing the ultimate dance, so to speak. ByteDance is doing the ultimate dance. And what's more fascinating, I think, is what you were pointing out earlier, Afra, when you were talking about TikTok's changed ownership, right? Because if recently in the news, TikTok is no longer owned majority, mostly by ByteDance, but it's owned by American investors and American companies, including Oracle. Yeah. And the question is, given this change of ownership, does it still potentially suffer from political influence given its owner's tight links to the present political power in this country, right? Does TikTok, in fact, continue to exist behind new walls? And I think that's a kind of fascinating plot twist to this particular Chuhai narrative.
So I think this true high narrative also relate to this one phenomenon I have observed is Silicon Valley's China jealous. Elon Musk has explicitly said, I want X to be something like WeChat because he eagerly wants to build a super app like WeChat. And Mark Zuckerberg himself also expressed the WeChat jealousy. And I think there's this moment where there's this one narrative I keep instilling into my mind is that I left China to come to the US for school, but also for freedom, also for the freedom on the internet. But I think in 2025, there's this moment where you realize that the wall has, in a sense, dissolved a little bit, and a lot of content, a lot of the aesthetic sensibilities, logic, memes start to appear on the American social timelines where I was in. The walls start to, in a sense, dissolve, but you see more wars being built up. And lately, there's this weird phenomenon, I think, relate to Chuhai, relate to certain China envy or China jealous, which is called China maxing. I don't know if you heard of China maxing. As a multinational brain router myself, I definitely seen a lot of memes where people start to drink hot water and saying, today I'm feeling very Chinese, or people saying something like, this is a very Chinese moment of my life, and doing something that's like quintessentially Chinese, such as like practicing Tai Chi in a park. I think the younger me who would believe in this, like the US has free internet and China doesn't have free internet. This binary already dissolved in my own mind. And I think this story that I constantly inject in my mind to justify certain things like can no longer be justified. So Yi-Ling, so back to you, like, what do you think of this China maxing moment? Because you read about internet in both worlds. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by it. I mean, it's wild to me. But I think like we can situate China maxing in this like broader vibe shift that has taken place over the past year. For any of you who are hyper online, Afra, like, you know, we've discussed this vibe shift. I think if I can trace its origins, it would probably be last January when DeepSeek released its AI model R1 and when the TikTok refugees were migrating to Red Note or Xiaohongshu, there was this kind of collective, oh my gosh, China is a technological powerhouse that took place among, I would call the chattering class, the abundance policy wonks, perhaps the Asia Society event goers. But there was a kind of intellectual reckoning, I think, among a lot of people who realized that, wow, China is really catching up and nipping at our heels. I remember seeing a lot of Silicon Valley tech founders and kind of New York Times op-ed pundits take these 2-week trips to China and remark on like, oh my gosh, there are dancing humanoids. And
so China century.
Exactly. Like there are Huawei cars and high-speed rail. Everyone became obsessed with high-speed rail. And then it became kind of like burst into mainstream consciousness as well. You had like influencers like Hassan Piker and I Showed Speed going to Chongqing and being like, look at all these drones, you know? And I think what I want to emphasize with this particular vibe shift in China maxing is it really doesn't reveal anything about China at all. I think it says a lot more about Americans and the United States. I don't think, you know, when I talk to people in China and when I visit, I don't think it suddenly became shinier and all this high-speed rail just built itself over the year. I think that Americans have kind of essentially projected their own fears and envies and desires onto China as this two-dimensional mirror, so to speak, a rhetorical mirror. And I think Americans have become really fascinated by Chinese high-speed rail because they're frustrated with their inability to build high-speed rail, right? I think it's rooted in this frustration with dysfunction and the inability to build infrastructure in the physical world. So I'm a bit torn about this China maxing dynamic. On one hand, I love the idea of people really engaging with and trying to understand China from a place of genuine curiosity and understanding. I am less psyched about and more wary about turning China into this rhetorical mirror to project one's own fears and fantasies and desires.
There's this fascinating moment where when the US is experiencing China maxing moment, China is simultaneously experiencing America doomer moment. A lot of the internet users, like people perpetually online in China, are very obsessed with the decline, like the hellish scene in the US. There's this popular term called 斩杀线, Q line, right? It's a game term, but eventually this terminology to describe how fragile the American middle class is, because if you get sick, if you get into a car accident, if you have anything like certain misfortune happens in your life, you can instantly, your life can drop below this Q line, and you will never be able to restore your previous this like social status or social class anymore. And I remember the U.S. when I was growing up, the U.S. used to be the beacon, and the Chinese people used to project a lot of their hope and aspirations and the good things about the U.S. because of the free speech, because of this entrepreneurial potentials, and because of the personal agency that American people have and American society was able to give them. And now I think it's really interesting to see this reversely, that some US people in the US, especially the younger generation, start to see China in a sense as the beacon who's like building the future, like building physical stuff, like doing cool things. So there's this concept Kevin Kelly gave in his book called Cool China. This China that's constantly producing stuff that people want to buy, want to like emulate, and want to follow. A little bit tangent, but like going back to your book, I think one theme that strikes me the most is you're constantly talking about technology with private and personal life through certain political expression. So a lot of people who are sitting here in this room are diasporas. And I do think when you become a diaspora, like a Chinese person living in the US, you actually never like stay away from the wall. So my question is, how does distance create its kind of own dance, and how, as Chinese diaspora specifically, can still participate the meaningful actions that are happening on the Chinese internet?
How can the diaspora dance?
How can the diaspora dance?
How many in the room would identify as part of the Chinese diaspora? Okay, a good number. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that you asked this question, Afra, because being part of the diaspora, any diaspora, but in particular the Chinese diaspora, it can be a pretty lonely and at times painful experience, right? You're kind of existing constantly in this state of transient uncertainty. You wonder if and when you'll return home. You wonder, where is home? You probably find yourself squeezed between two different sides, a home where you potentially can't do the type of work that you find meaningful, or can't build the communities that you want to build. And then now an outside world that increasingly looks upon the Chinese diaspora and Chinese nationals with fear and suspicion, right? Where visas being a lot harder to get and people getting turned away at the border. What to do about it? There's like how to do the dance. I guess there's like a higher level way to answer that and a more concrete way to answer that. The higher level way is to reject narratives that are imposed on you and imposed on the diaspora, right? To reject the idea that you have to be, and when I say you, I'm also addressing myself, but reject the idea that you have to be a pawn in somebody else's geopolitical game. Resist, I think, this myth that people are talking about all the time of an inevitable US-China race. Resist and push back against narratives that force you to demonize or, in the case of China maxing, glorify the other. And I think instead of that, right, when people are talking about differences and races and opposition, look for shared experience and common ground. Right? Lean into your role as somebody who has one foot in one world and one foot in another. Be a bridge builder and be a connector in a world where we're seeing a lot of borders and hardened walls. What does that look like concretely? There are many people in the room who are doing this every single day, and I have so much admiration for them, yourself included, Afra. That could be starting a newsletter where you're expressing your own unique voice as part of this diaspora. It could be launching a podcast like the beloved Loud Murmurs that we all loved, that amplifies voices that challenge this narrative of China as monolith. Create a mutual aid group that spans WeChat and WhatsApp and Signal. And I think probably the most important thing would be to create physical spaces too. Because I think physical spaces are really where people feel a sense of trust and belonging. And I think one of the most important things that I've realized about this diasporic dance is that it's really important to, and Lupine is one of these characters in my book who has done this really well. It's really important to locate a sense of home and belonging that is not rooted in the nation state. So a sense of home and belonging that's really rooted in the relationships that you nurture and the communities that you build.
Yeah, I do think, in a sense, talking about diaspora, talking about dancing as a diaspora, Loud Murmurs is actually, when I was reading about
You want to introduce Loud Murmurs, Afra, a little?
When I was reading about Lupine, it's just almost like reliving a past life where flashback of how Loud Murmur was even get started. It is all of a sudden, I think there's this sense on the Chinese internet, a lot of women start to talk in their own voice. I think it is such an empowering voice. And then thanks to the Rice Bunny, the Me Too movement, where we realized the importance of just create our own platform and just without any permission, just to say things we want to say. And I think that to me is a homecoming moment almost. But thank you, Loud Murmurs. Shout out to Loud Murmurs and the Loud Murmur energy.
Loud Murmurs is a brilliant podcast that Afra founded along with 3 other very talented women.
Okay. It's really hard not get a little bit sentimental to talk about Loud Murmurs. But
no crying, only at the book.
Okay, so I want to ask the last question, and then after that, the floor is yours. This last question is about dignity. So you write those protagonists in your book, and a huge part of the book is they seek freedom and connection, as the book title suggested. But there is this ultimate pursuit of dignity, and at the same time, I realized that a lot of the American users, the internet users in the West, start to lose this dignity that internet and technology used to empower us. I found people are utterly disappointed and shocked when they're trying to search certain keywords on the US-owned TikTok but couldn't find anything. And they're shocked and feeling ashamed when the algorithm silenced them, shadow banned them. And you told me that Americans are going to learn how to be wall dancers too. Americans need to learn from the Chinese wall dancers how to dance better. So can you tell us what do you mean by that, and how can America better their practice?
From the diasporic dance to the American dance. I will say I was pretty surprised during the process of writing this book, the extent to which the US internet would begin to resemble the Chinese one. That was not how this book was supposed to end. But, you know, just as the romance of the Chinese internet, which I write about, this romance of the Chinese internet being this force of liberalization and freedom has waned, so has the fantasy of the World Wide Web as this free and open space. We see this in the way that a lot of forces that have shaped the Chinese internet are hardly unique to the Chinese internet, right? You mentioned some of the things you mentioned. We see the amplification of illiberal voices and nationalist voices. We see the retreat from the public sphere. We see the erosion of what Hannah Arendt called common sense, this like common shared understanding. One example that I like to give is if we were to look at Weibo, for example, the largest microblogging platform in China. Back in 2011, people called it this harbinger of free speech. And today, there is a Chinese intellectual who described Weibo as a maggot-infested pile of shit. And, you know, just completely overrun with patriotic incels and trolls. The same goes with Twitter, right? At some point, it was described as this throbbing networked intelligence that was going to topple regimes across the world. And now it's described by my fellow journalists as a hell site or a cesspool. And it happens to be also shaped by one of the most powerful men in the world. So yeah, I find this pretty bleak, this sense that Americans are going to learn to have to be wall dancers too. What does it actually mean? Like, what does it actually mean to dance? I don't want to be prescriptive or dogmatic. I think it's a deeply individual thing to decide how you want to negotiate your relationship with the state, right? Like when a media company decides they want to lay off their talk show host, in the fear of political backlash, what are its employees supposed to do? When the tech elite decides they want to kowtow to the current administration and align their rhetoric with their policies, what are its employees supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? But I think at the very kind of like individual granular level, I think we are all going to have to ask ourselves questions that the wall dancers have been asking themselves their whole lives. And I think those are questions like, what does it mean to really think for yourself and form your own opinion in an online landscape that's completely warped by algorithmic control? It means how do I protect my private life, my relationships, my attachments, my beliefs from state encroachment? It probably means thinking about what does it mean to nurture solidarity and create community across borders and geographies at a moment when we're increasingly polarized and siloed. And I think it just ultimately means that every day we need to be acting with the belief that even within these super powerful systems of technological control, it is possible for every person to carve out their own space of freedom, openness, dignity.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yi-Ling's book
Don't
is.
cry, Afra.
I'm not gonna cry. Yeah, I'm just thinking. Anyways, I do think of you who came to Asian Society being here, 在场, right? Being here and being part of this book talk, it is a way of reclaiming your mind, and it is a way of practicing certain like dignity, I would say. And now the time is yours. If you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, Izzy first. Yeah.
Please speak into the
Okay, thank you so much for writing this book. I have to say I wasn't paid to promote it, but I just want everybody to buy it. It's such a good book. The writing is beautiful, and like Afra, I not only cried but also laughed out loud at one moment. It's that particular moment when Ma Baoli shook hands with Li Keqiang, and now you have the second most powerful man in China use the term comrade, which has been reclaimed by queer people in China in a sincere way. So I just really loved all the characters, and I think you managed to write a China that's both very contradictory, but also rendered with the kind of depth that can only comes from someone who can navigate both China and the Chinese internet and also the rest of the internet. And I really want to ask you, how did you decide when your own voice and when your own journey would come into the picture to let readers know who you are and what you paid attention to? Because there are a few moments, and I found them all very appropriate, but I wanted to understand how you arrived at those.
That's a great question. And thanks so much for shouting at that scene. That's one of my favorite scenes. Just for context, Ma Baoli is shaking the hands of Li Keqiang, and he says, "Greetings, Premier. I run a gay dating app." And the Premier says, "Thank you, comrade." And comrade means 同志, and 同志has also been reclaimed by China's queer community as to be gay. So how did I bring in my own voice as a writer and a person in this world into this book? Very tricky, very, very hard. I will say I knew right off the bat that I did not want to write memoir. This was not something I wanted to write. This was not my story. This was going to be a story about the subjects that I was fascinated by, and the wall dancers in particular. But I realized that it was impossible to tell this story without revealing my own subjective experience, right? We sometimes believe that writers and reporters can be perfectly objective, fly on the walls. But I was so invested in this narrative, right? Like all of the things that I was mentioning earlier in terms of the shared stakes. So I think I always revealed my hand. So where I thought my own perspective was important and might shape the way people understand the story, I wove that in. You know, I am from Hong Kong. I am both connected to China and the US. I'm queer. And so all of these different components of my identity were crucial in how people treated me. You know, a lot of people, when I was asking them questions, would just be like, who is this? Like, who is this cultural mongrel, you know? And so I think it was really important to reveal that sleight of hand. I think another way of thinking about it was I was maybe like a 0.5 subject, or maybe even a 0.2 subject. Like my full narrative arc was not completely present, but you also feel my sense of loss and heartbreak and discouragement when the romance of the Chinese internet wanes in the way that it does.
Thank you so much. Thanks for creating this physical space for us today. As a Red user who's probably spent 5 hours in this app, I really resemble a lot in the beginning of the book. You mentioned that last year when TikTok was banned temporarily here, a lot of users call them TikTok refugee, comes to Red and talk to users on Red app. It really fascinating for me. Like I scroll down the comment area, seeing a lot of kind words between the two countries. I know a lot of people from my country, they haven't really talked to American before, but I realized they're so kind, they're so encouragement, they're talking about nice words to their cats, dogs, and just really sentimental to me. Like our culture is really welcomed and exchanged in this moment. So, but we also see the restriction and the increasing of the wall. Like even Li Keqiang, as we mentioned, the premier has died, and there's more restriction comes out every day. I just wonder, do you see there's more opportunity like this? And also in terms of younger generation, because we grew up with, there's good time and bad times. We have seen the US movie, Hollywood movie, and all the great things from outside the world. So we wanted to use VPN and different ways, even to go abroad to study, to gain information from outside. But I was wondering, like, do you have, in your experience, do you talk to like maybe education system in China today, like for children who grow up today, like do they have opportunity to, or interest to know like more about the outside world instead of looking at what was provided today on CCTV?
No, thanks for your question. And I similarly felt delighted at the moment that TikTok refugees were meeting Xiaohongshu users for the first time, right? Because you had people sharing their grocery bills and like rental prices and talking about looking for their Chinese spy and, you know, like asking them for a cat tax, which if anyone doesn't know is a photo of your cat. It seems like your question is, do young Chinese, I'm assuming like Gen Z or younger, do they feel inclined to reach out across borders and understand what experiences are unlike their own, right? Am I interpreting your question correctly? You would maybe know better than me, honestly. I don't want to speak for all Chinese Gen Z, but there is this narrative, Afra, maybe you can chime in as well. There is this narrative of the younger generation being more patriotic. Alec has written very excellently on this topic. They grew up in a moment when China was standing up to the world after the Beijing Olympics. They did not see the kind of period of the 80s where everyone was obsessed with Friends, maybe, or the TV show, or, you know, like saw the United States as this kind of beacon. And so certainly there's maybe like more confidence and more patriotism among the younger generation. Obviously don't want to generalize. And I'm sure there are people who are just as eager and excited to reach over the border and to reach over those walls and understand what, you know, experiences unlike theirs are. So, I mean, that's all I can say. I can't really speak for that generation, but I am optimistic in their ability to connect.
Thank you so much for the conversation. It's so informative and very inspiring. And I really enjoy both of you talking. Like, it's so musical. It's so enjoyable. I have two questions, if it's okay. My first question is, what made you want to become a journalist or a writer? And second question is, did you also have that moment like Ma Baoli when he finished reading Beijing Story and had that sense of freedom? Did you have that moment with this book, like to get inspired to constitute the idea for this book? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for those questions. Sorry, remind me what the first question is again? Journalism. Why did I come in? I was like, I blacked out that question because I didn't want to answer. No, I'm joking. I always wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a fiction writer. And then I realized that to be a fiction writer, you have to be very lonely, and you spend large amounts of your time holed away in a room dreaming up characters without actually talking to real humans. And I love talking to real humans. And I realized that journalism was a way to tell stories while actually interacting with the real world and absorbing that and distilling those narratives into something equally as powerful as fiction. So that was my kind of entry point to becoming a journalist. As for a moment of awakening, though that might be too strong of a term, I kind of think of the origins of this book to when I was 15. And yeah, it's been a long journey. And I was interning at the time at a state media publication in Beijing. And I was writing an article about Hong Kong literary magazines. And the editor of the magazine wanted to publish this story to coincide with the June 4th crackdown. And I wrote up this interview transcript, sent it to my editor at the state-run publication, and she said, "This is great, but please no references to June 4th." And I was a little stunned. You know, I wasn't naive. Like, I knew what you couldn't touch. I knew that this wasn't something that I'd ever be able to write about in a state-run publication. But this was the first time, as someone who grew up from Hong Kong, that the state line was on my own words, right? And I felt kind of both indignant, like, how dare you take away my words, you know, but also kind of intrigued, because I was like, this must be a dynamic that people have to grapple with every single day. And what does it mean to write with truth and integrity while operating within these constraints? And I like to think of that as like the beginning point for when this investigation began.
Hi, thank you both so much. Both of you are so articulate. It's inspiring. But I wanted to ask, maybe it's a little bit out of scope and also a two-parter question, but how are you viewing freedom when you're asking the question of, can freedom exist not just on the Chinese internet, but I guess I'm wondering, can freedom and connection exist on the internet? Through what lens are you defining freedom in that question? And my second question is also, is there any way that the Chinese internet gets closer to achieving that freedom or connection in the way you're defining it that we don't experience in the West because of the state like interplay with how society or like users use the internet there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, big question. How do I define freedom? I don't have a definition of freedom. I think my definition of freedom is the ability for self-actualization. I'm not trying to cop out of your question, but I think freedom is to allow people to define for themselves what it means to be free. If it means to be free to love a certain way or express themselves a certain way or to behave a certain way, you know, I think that's really up to the individual. As for your second question, which is the Chinese internet in some ways freer than the American one because of its... I want to say no, but I will say that a lot of Chinese users, internet users that I've spoken with, and myself included, are much more aware of the walls that they operate within, right? I think a lot of American internet users assume and take for granted that the web they step into is one that's free, when actually all of us are kind of ensnared in these endless feeds and our attention is being extracted for profit. And now we're being attachment hacked. That's a word that I just learned, where AI companion bots are essentially keeping you bound and dependent on them by hacking your attachment systems. So I think both internets are not free. The Chinese internet is very unfree in a lot of different ways, but a lot of Chinese internet users are at least aware of the shackles that they find themselves in.
Hi, thank you so much for the conversation. It's very fascinating. My question is regarding to this especially after the pandemic, we see this more and more conflicts when people calls for between the freedom of speech online and the pursuit for to get rid of disinformation and combating disinformation, and which is because I grew up in China. And I know that the Chinese government always love to use the terms disperse the rumors as this kind of excuse to crack down freedom of speech, and we see this kind of rhetoric more and more obvious in the Western world, especially after the pandemic, both in the United States and in Western Europe. So how do you view this kind of conflict between disinformation and freedom of speech online?
So how do we regulate disinformation online?
I would say it's more like the balance between disinformation, combating disinformation, even government sponsoring propaganda, and freedom of speech online.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I wish we had hundreds of policymakers thinking about this question. And honestly, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to strike that balance. I think that one of the things that we're seeing right now in the internet with regards to disinformation is a lot of flooding, right? This dynamic that we call flooding, where trolls, incels, people who potentially are paid by political power kind of put a lot of information that is illiberal, nationalist, attacking someone in the hopes that they can drown out voices that they don't like, right? And that used to be a dynamic that I saw mostly on the Chinese internet, but I see that today take place on Twitter all the time as well. I think this is a clear example of something that perhaps should be regulated. How it should be regulated, that's a problem that the current administration needs to think about. But unfortunately, they seem to be proponents of it as opposed to people who are actually regulating it. So I think I feel pretty pessimistic about how people in power are answering that question. And at this point, it really depends on us, people who are using the internet, to actually be able to discern, what is disinformation, what is something that is truth that I can believe in and I can swallow. But I don't know what the policymakers should be doing, to be perfectly honest.
Last question. Gentleman? Yeah. Wait. Oh, okay.
Thank you. This was such a great conversation and really insightful. One question I wanted to ask about, it's like this theme that I've noticed on the internet lately is this sense of, people within a community censoring others within that same community. And it's something I noticed just across the board on both the left and the right these past few years. And I used to work in broadcast journalism briefly. And one of my biggest struggles was kind of censoring myself and thinking about how will this material be perceived by others. And I'm sure between that and just, a lot of this increasing distrust in journalism, it's a pretty fraught environment for journalists right now. And I'm just wondering, with your upbringing in China and also kind of seeing similar patterns of censorship within a community in America, if you struggle with self-censorship yourself in your material, how you kind of navigate through that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that question, because I feel like I've had a lot of friends in the US tell me exactly the same thing, where because of the kind of encroachment of state censorship and the political powers at large, kind of because of their fear of their backlash, they've kind of raised the scalpel on their own words or have decided not to speak out. And it makes me quite sad because I always associated with a kind of uniquely Chinese experience, but seeing it unfold here is troubling. I definitely experience it. Yeah, I definitely feel like I have to self-censor, mostly because of fear of harming the people that I'm writing about or care about and the communities that they care about. And I think I can just tell you personally how I deal with it and how I think people should deal with it. I think that fear is very corrosive and it's literally harmful to your body. and it feels really bad. And when you have something to say and you want to express it and it doesn't come out, that's a recipe for disaster. I think that it is possible to discern between what's something that you want to write for yourself in a small readership and a small audience of trusted friends, acquaintances that will allow you to feel seen and heard. And there is writing for a public audience that will promote a certain message or get a certain story across to a wider readership. And you don't always have to do the latter, right? Like, you don't always have to share your most intimate private thoughts on Instagram or Twitter or some public fora. It is okay to write purely for the sake of self-expression and community. And it is just as brave to do that as it is to write for a large and public readership. And what that line is really for you to decide. I think we shouldn't expect people to have to blast their thoughts to a social media sphere that is hostile and violent.
Okay. And now Yi-Ling can book sign, and you can all purchase the book. And based on my reading experience, I shall guarantee you this is much better than TikTok doom scrolling. It's more entertaining and more profound. And also, I would love to invite everyone to give a round of applause to Yi-Ling for for bringing this book to the world and show us the power of writing and what is possible. Yeah, thank you.